Hello, Yakri here with another Warframe video. This time I'm looking at the Phage, and I just want to talk about the build for it and its overall effectiveness as a weapon, especially compared to some of the other beam weapons like the Amprax, the Synapse, and the Atomos, right? And I'm not going to say, I'm including a Rivet in this build in particular. It lacks a bit of punch without one, unfortunately, I feel. But yeah, of course you can still use it without one. It's still a very good status weapon, especially since it's a shotgun and it has all these different tendrils, so you can use its unfocused in fire mode, and we'll show that off more in a bit, to apply statuses to a lot of enemies in a little AoE, which can be very handy on mid to high level missions when you don't need to focus in on enemies very often. Anyway, I'm not going to promise you this is the best build, but it's the one I'm using right now. It's possible this could actually be better as a crit weapon abusing hunter munitions, although with 19% base critical, I think you kind of need a crit chance Riven to really make it work well when it's a shotgun, right? If you don't have that point strike amazing critical bonus that primary rifles have. So yeah, this is what I'm using right now, just as an example. It's not something that I spent like hours slaving over in Warframe Builder to ensure it's the absolute highest DPS, but it works very well, and I prefer this somewhat higher status chance. High fire rate can also be pretty good. Okay, so I've spawned up some level 125 bombards, or not bombards, heavy gunners, which is kind of my standard for testing weapons at this point, and it also is what I use when testing the Amprex and the Synapse in previous videos, so it should be relatively comparable. And so the Phage is a little bit more slow to kill enemies than compared to the Amprex or the Synapse, really. Either of those weapons ramps up a little bit faster, especially because of hunter munitions in particular, but also because they're just a little bit higher damage weapons, DPS weapons, I think, at least in practical terms. However, there is one thing I really like about the Phage compared to either of those weapons. I guess it doesn't compare too unfavorably, or the Amprex doesn't compare too unfavorably in this regard, but the Phage you can AoE like this, right? And if you line it up correctly and you have punch through on your weapon, which you should probably squeeze into the build, you're going to be able to hit through enemies with all these tendrils pretty effectively, right? And of course, the per enemy ramp up isn't a really big deal when you're hitting all of the enemies at once, right? And this lets me get a lot more value out of a single ammo clip, and I can kind of demolish this group of heavy gunners, right? Which, you know, is not a realistic situation while running a mission, but running into this many enemies that are this tough to kill isn't a very realistic situation either, right? So neither having them grouped up or having them be this tough is realistic. But the reason I do it like this is because, of course, if a weapon can, you know, demolish a patch of level 120 heavy gunners without 4x corrosive projection, when they're like just sitting around like that, then it's not going to have a very hard time with more realistic groups of enemies where you probably have 2 CP in your party if you're not running full on 4x CP, and you probably have some kind of damage boost half the time, and it's probably like one heavy gunner and a bunch of like Corpus crewmen or something, you know, in your like void mission, right? And they're gonna die a lot easier actually than just these guys standing around, even if they're moving and shit, right? So okay, let's just give an example though. Versus a group of guys, like let's take 2 heavy gunners, right? Let's get 2 arid butchers, and let's get like Crackmaster. Nah, let's get a dog. Oops, that's 0. Just 1, and like 2 elite crewmen. There's like a little hodgepodge of units, right? Spawn those. Okay. So if we run over here and just spray these guys down with the AoE, right? Not even focused in. They're not going to last too terribly long, right? Level 125, so still pretty good, but not super great for them, is it? You know, yeah. Get the whole group of them done before I run through an ammo clip. right? And frankly, a lot of people pitch the simulacrum as being unrealistic for enemy groupings, but although you're going to often have like single dudes you have to burn down, you're also going to have groups of enemies that are much more grouped up than you will see in the simulacrum. So let's try the same group of enemies. Let's unpause the AI, and I'll just go kill them for an example. But I think I've pretty much covered my point on the Phage. It's not quite as, oh, they're going to fight each other because they're opposite factions. Whoops, I should have just done all Grenier. The Phage is not quite as good as some of the other high-powered beam weapons, right? It's definitely not as good as the Atomos or the Amprex, in my opinion, because both of those weapons actually end up doing more DPS or similar amounts of DPS in the case of the Atomos. But the Atomos chains between 5 enemies, which is just ridiculously good utility, even compared to the little AoE ability of the Phage, right? And the Amprex has its chaining between close by enemies, and overall does a lot more DPS and status procs per second than the Atomos usually. And is also a much better 100 munitions weapon. The Atomos doesn't really do crit builds, which makes it a little bit more overpowered. The Synapse is a bit more of a realistic comparison. It kills single enemies more quickly, but the Phage can kind of avoid some of the downfall of this per-target ramp-up we've got going on, right? With beam weapons by doing the wide spread. And if you start with a wide spread and then focus in, you can evade some of that per target ramp up or make it matter a little bit less, right? If you like burn down the weaker enemies using the spread and then focus in on the big ones, the per target ramp up is already going to be gone. So this weapon ends up getting a good bit of utility through this little focus in capability, which, you know, it's not a top tier weapon, but it's definitely comfortably usable, right? Like you can use anything in high tier weapons. You can take the Mark 1 Bratton out, you know, or the Mark 1 Paris, and you can go and do okay in high tier missions, but it's going to kind of suck, and you're probably going to have to use a damage boosting frame. And this weapon is not like top tier, but it's good enough that you can use it around in most missions in the game and not have too bad of a time with it, neither because it's going to be unable to do enough damage to kill high level enemies. It can do that, and it has the utility with this unfocused mode, right, where it just does a spray to take out crowds of crappier enemies. So I've had a decent amount of fun with it in the star map, and yeah, the beam weapon mechanics work fairly like normally on it, I guess. Stop it from being crazy good, and don't totally shit on it and make it bad at killing level 50s. Yeah, I think that kind of sums that up. So I don't think there's anything else I want to talk about with the Phage, because someone's going to complain if I don't do it. I will make another video, perhaps using it in a Sortie 3 or something later on to just show that off. I did another one where I like briefly used it, but I only had 4 mods on it. I didn't actually have a full build. And yeah, so it's one of my more favorite beam weapons, although it still can't hold a candle to the Amprex. But you know, I don't know if I can complain too much because I do like the Amprex. So yeah, all right, Yakari out.